welcome to the Faith in Arts Project, hosted by the University of North Carolina, Asheville and Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center. I'm Rick Chess of UNC Asheville. This project offers us an opportunity to explore the role of arts in spiritual practice and religious life, and the role of spiritual practice and religious life in the arts. In the aftermath of the postponement of the Faith and Arts Institute, originally scheduled for May 2020, we've been developing digital programming featuring artists and scholars whose work may offer us fresh ways of thinking about the connections at this moment between religion, spirituality, and the arts. We began in May with a Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center Instagram takeover. Our work continues with the Faith in Arts Research Project, a series of conversations with artists and scholars. The project will culminate in fall 2021 with the rescheduled Faith in Arts Institute. You can learn more about the project on our websites at Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center and UNC Asheville. Again, welcome. Now, on to the conversation with Jeff Arnold, Executive Director of Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center, and André Daughtry, a Brooklyn-based interdisciplinary photography and media artist, writer, and performer, and minister of the arts at Judson Church.
Hi, André.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we launch into your work, I wanted to ask if we could take a moment for you to share a bit about your background and about how you arrived to your current work and projects and how the gravity of Judson Memorial Church factored into that path.
Sure. I don't know if this is for everyone, but for a lot of creative folks that I know and that I grew up with, I guess going back to high school, just having a feeling that a 9-to-5 job wasn't going to be it for me, the first and foremost. I played a lot of music. My mother is a classically trained musician. I sang in all of her choirs. So music sustained me for the beginning, first 18 years of my life. I'm a drummer and also had multiple years of piano lessons. I'm not a great pianist, but there's a term now called keyboardist.
Nice.
So I have my MIDI controllers, and I do know my scales, and I can play chords and mix a little bit of sampling in there and all that. But so that was definitely, I was so music focused growing up. When I got to college, though, I got a chance to take a photography course, and there was something about photography that I was interested in, but I was very anti-school growing up. So anything that made you stay an extra hour or two after the bell rang, I just wasn't going to be down for it. I just wanted to get out of there. So I would go hang out with my friends and we would listen to music and play music. And so that's what sustained me. But getting to college, as I said, I got to take a photography course, and I did the photography course, and my sophomore year in college, I actually did a year abroad in France, just next to Geneva, Switzerland. And so I got to make multiple trips to Florence. And I had my camera with me and my Tri-X black and white film, and I took pictures the entire year. And then when I got back to my home university in Michigan, I just lived in the darkroom and just developed the rolls of film that I had accumulated from that entire year. I still was playing music. I was a DJ, hip hop clubs and house music. And then I was also a drummer for a couple of different hardcore punk bands. So very much involved in music, but really started concentrating on images and the things that images are able to say or not able to say. Mixed with language, and just really found that making images was really like a big thing that was calling me, and it was calling me as much as the music, and then started to overcome the music, and I stuck with that. After graduating, I got into working in fashion photography. I moved back to Europe and then came back to the States. I was born in New York and grew up in Jersey, so I came and started taking my book around and started working with fashion photographers here in the city. my career as a photo assistant, I got to work on Italian Vogue and W Magazine and all those things. And what I noticed was all the references that were being used for the photo shoots were very artistic references. If we were shooting male models for Vogue, the photographer would say, "Oh, Velasquez." And so, my curious self, I wanted to know, well, what does Velasquez have to do with the male portraits? And so I would go to the Met. And I started going to the Met once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week. I would go literally 3, 4 times a week if I wasn't on a job, and start looking at, the great thing about the Met and great institutions like the Louvre and stuff is the chronological order that they put things in, and also the juxtapositions. So you can have neoclassicism of Ingres on one side of the wall, and then the romantic response of Delacroix and Géricault on the other side of the wall in the same room. At the Louvre, they have wings that are just opposing each other, but you can see where those conversations were. And I was drawing at the Art Students League at the time, which a lot of famous artists went through. It's like the pre-MFA kind of thing to do. It's an atelier type of education. So I was there drawing and, looking at my shading and my composition and everything to prepare me for the world and fashion photography that I was preparing myself for. But I also like to read. And so I started reading about the time periods. What was Romanticism, and started to come into understanding of like, well, it's not just a label that's put on the movement of the work, but it's a movement in thought. Same thing with neoclassicism, and then realism, which is still my favorite, coming with Courbet, who's from Franche-Comté, outside of Besançon, where I was an English high school teacher for a year, my second year in France. So I got to visit Courbet's natal village a lot, or no, that's what it's called, and really got into what Courbet was doing, which was coming into a realist movement that was saying that the conversations between the neoclassicists and the romanticists was not even important, that he could, walk down the side of the road and see an older man doing his profession of being a stone breaker, and his grandson right next to him at the beginning of his work life doing that. And Courbet would turn and say, well, there's all the metaphor that you need. So we don't have to have the Greek gods and the biblical stories and stuff, but, metaphor and what the substance of life is right here in reality right in front of me. And I bring up realism because it's so connected to obviously photography, right? Photography comes into a moment where it starts to overtake portraiture because of just the mimesis, right? The likeness aesthetics of being so close to the reality, and quicker and more efficient in a way than painting. That allowed painting to go into more questions of abstraction. And so looking at what it is that I'm interested in as the documentary artist, it definitely goes back and relates to conversations around capturing life as is in front of the lens, the same way that the realist painters like a Corot and Gustave Courbet made their break from the previous tension between the neoclassicists and the romanticists and the academic paintings as well. So then quickly after that, what was it? The financial crash came in around 2009. And I kind of knew at that time that I had been a photo assistant for about 7 years, and I was also a set design assistant. So I really got into like what this world was, doing commercial work. And I just had a feeling that I don't know if selling shoes or bags was going to be the fullest conversation that I was going to be able to have. So the financial crash happened, and long story short, everybody's scrambling for money and jobs, and the advertisers are cutting their budgets and all of that. And so when you're a young photographer about to break from being an assistant to now I'm really going to strike out, you normally take those smaller jobs But because of the financial crash, those smaller jobs were eaten up by, bigger photographers who needed to maintain their way of life. And so I just kind of saw myself at a little crossroads. But I was actually prepared for the crossroads because I had started reading critical theory around that time, and what was postmodernism and postmodernism's critique of what modernism was. And that was all just an extension of me learning about the different artistic time periods. And then I'm starting to connect that with, Marxism and critiques of capitalism. And so I had applied to, never been to art school. I did do photography classes, but never been to art school. I applied to Columbia University's School of the Arts MFA program, and I got an interview, and I ultimately got waitlisted, which is fine because I got to go to Cal Arts, which is the school that I came to discover was where I really needed to go as far as interdisciplinary education and experimental, and which is why my interest of Black Mountain College is there, because that in America is the first really experimental school. I mean, we have the Bauhaus in Europe, and then we have Black Mountain College, and then Cal Arts, which is still existing today. So that there's no walls. There's you come in as a painter and leave as a dancer. That kind of like feeling that my alma mater and Black Magic present, and then my association, obviously with Judson, which we'll get to. That openness was the type of pedagogy that I really needed. So after the financial crisis, I just set my eyes on trying to get into Cal Arts and see what that actually meant to start calling yourself like a full-time, artist, where all of your output was in connection to the deep things that. And then I say deep as far as deep coming out of one's personhood, the questions that are coming out of oneself, and the areas to be able to ask those questions and investigate those things. The going the route of fine art really has been satisfying that, and is the journey that I'm very happy to have embarked on and still be continuing on today.
And what about seminary? How did that come about?
Well, that's part 2 to the story.
Yeah, that's part 2. It's so fascinating, Andre, and I thank you for taking the time to tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, well, obviously, everybody's way of how they get to what it is that they want to talk about is a different route. A lot of people go to the MFA programs and they have a subject matter, but the professors are there, or faculty are there to help refine that, help you get to it. My thing that happened to me was Cal Arts was very much the place where I needed to like really kind of work out which mediums that I like to work with, right? So because of Cal Arts, I work heavily with contemporary dancers, with movers. Most of my work has a lot of movement in it. And I found that the dancers at Cal Arts were the figures in front of the lens that I was able to have a conversation with about form, which is different than with actors. So, and as a people photographer, and I do some still life, but as a people photographer coming out of that collaborative fashion background, I found that those conversations with the dancers were very much aligned with what it was that I was looking for. But that being said, ultimately, the conversations that I wanted to have at Cal Arts, I had great mentors. Tom Leeser is one of them, and Michelle Dizon, an excellent art photographer. Excellent mentors. But at the end of the day, the things that were really deep to my personhood, I didn't really have anybody to talk about that with. So I was able to make the work that I needed, and I was able to make work that I'm very proud of. But I just knew that there was a little bit more education, or if not just necessary education, more of a community of the people who were going to be talking about the things that I had questions about. So looking at seminary was an important step for me, because in the art world and art school and everything, there's a lot of continental philosophy that is used to help give us lenses of critique of, like I said, postmodernism's critique of modernism. but I also had a critique of postmodernism. I also had a critique of capitalism from a Buddhist perspective, or what's a critique of capitalism from the concept of the Sabbath or the year of Jubilee coming out of the Torah, the Hebrew scriptural tradition. And so I wasn't going to get that at Cal Arts, no way, no how. So I applied to Union Theological Seminary here in New York, across the street from Columbia University. And I got into the theology and the arts program. And so I got an MA in theology and the arts. And I was very serious about turning my seminary 2 years into a studio degree, not to an academic degree. So my master thesis project was a film. And it's a film that got me, I submitted to the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and I got into the 2018-19 residency, which I love because the conversations that I'm having about expanding paradigms of what can be talked about, I love the fact that my seminary project got me into a contemporary art space. And so those are the types of tensions that are the primary basis of my work, no matter if the subject matter that I pick up is immigration justice, it being a spiritual injustice, and working with the New Sanctuary movement that's based at Judson, or thinking about ecology and how do we have indigenous people's relationships, non-anthropocentric relationships to the world. Looking at rocks as having a form of subjecthood and animals having a subjecthood, and being able to give personhood rights to a river, looking at traditions that are coming out, ideas that have been with indigenous communities for years, but rediscovering them for myself. Those types of dealing with tradition and spirituality, mysticism, shamanism, those types of conversations that may not necessarily be considered traditional art talk, or in a secular society might even be considered anti-progressive in a way of what does it actually mean to be making work that's critical about their situation and the reality that we're in. But I'm always fueled by going back and looking at people who changed paradigms by changing conversations. That's why Courbet is to this day still a hero for me, because that probably was a very daunting task to look at, beautiful neoclassical odalisque paintings on one side, and then the very emotional, colorful, less concentration on draftsmanship and more concentration on emotion and spirit that comes from, obviously going back to Titian, because he's from Venice, and the Venetians had more colors than Raphael and Michelangelo and the Roman painters. So yeah, that colorless line, Titian and Peter Paul Rubens, and then getting down to Delacroix, I've already mentioned, and then going to Courbet, and then through Degas and Matisse. It's just these folks that played with different materials. And I consider when I'm talking about critiquing capitalism from a mindfulness meditation aspect, that's a different material that one is working with. And so I care about that. So I needed to go and get an education outside of as experimental of the school Cal Arts is, but outside of the paradigms of what can be talked about as far as where art can mine its resources to make people aware through experience of things that have always been around, but they don't necessarily see, or that have become blinded because of dogma or ideologies of the time period that we're living in. So seminary gave me that it gave me that excuse to continue to make what I felt like I was going to in the direction, but without having to make work that was expected, right? Answering the call of, well, if I'm an African American, then I must be making African American or race critical theory types of works, and that's part of my work as well. But I'm entering from a different aspect, from a different axial entry point when thinking about community and the creation of awareness through ritual and spiritual traditions at the end of the day. So that's where the seminary part comes in, and really put the I don't know if stamp is the right word, but definitely put the route in front of me of, oh wow, this is a whole lane that I can occupy, which is the lane that I probably was the most fearful at times to actually pursue. And seminary gave me the strength to be in class and know that we are doing a cross analysis of concepts of discipline and power, a la Foucault, along with the book of Isaiah. It's very important to me, to my personhood, and I hope that for any artist, it's not about me making something that so people can come and say, oh, Andre, yes, let's just hear about your life. It's more about, I hope that the work that I make as a result of my life allows other people to flourish more in their lives,
Sure.
as well. And that's the biggest intention. I do find that more people want to learn how to incorporate spiritual practice along with artistic practice. And if I can just be someone that is a form of a guide because I found my route, and then hopefully people will have inspiration to be able to find their route of how to actually deal with the recognition of all of these things that actually make up a person and therefore a society and therefore an entire global community at the end of the day.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I know that I've had, such a moving kind of experience exploring your work and reading about it and reading what you've written, preparing for our conversation today. And, I think this leads right into my next question, which kind of will get closer to, to talking about some of the pieces that you wanted to talk about. But I was reading about your piece that you wrote about Paul Tillich. And I love that at the end of that essay on Tillich, Judson, and the avant-garde, you thank him for giving ideas as a light to a church community who were attempting to become a spiritual community by way of the avant-garde. And so profound and so moving. And I wondered if you could just also talk briefly about Tillich and how he's influenced your work.
Sure. Yeah. So Paul Tillich was a former professor at Union Theological Seminary. Union Theological Seminary had 2 or 3 faculty who were some of the last generation of theologians who made it on the front cover of Time magazine. Paul Tillich was one of them. I think Ryan Holneber was another one. And so, this thing of dealing with ethics and morals and spiritual traditions, but Paul Tillich coming and becoming a self-proclaimed theologian of culture. He was on the board at MoMA. And to be able to look from a theological lens, what abstract expressionism was trying to do, that was very compelling for me. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to go study at Union. And I didn't know about Paul Tillich before going to Union, but I just had a sense because of Cornel West, having taught at Union when I was there and also starting out at Union at the beginning of his teaching career. Just kind of knew that it was a place that had an immense engagement, not just with critical theory and thinking, but also like its public engagement. And art is a form of public engagement by way of I don't want to just say theory, but of just having deep investigations. There's an investigatory process that is in the art making process, and then the public gets to be a part of that investigation as well. So Paul Tillich was very much a leader in this theological critique into the art world. So and then as I wrote in the paper, Tillich has these definitions of a latent church and spiritual community. Just to break down the terms a little bit, the latent church was this concept of where you have the church itself that has its tradition, but then you also have the artists or individuals in society who have an autonomous relationship And he saw that the church, the Latent Church, was a place where doctrine and history should always be critiqued and by the autonomous approach, but then the autonomous approach of the individual could be buttressed by the spiritual community that comes and supports that kind of investigation and work to happen. And that's exactly what happened at Judson, the formation of the Judson Dance Theater. And obviously many of the artists that trained at Black Mountain College and went to start work at Judson, Alan Caprose, and all those folks. The clergy were moved by Paul Tillich's understanding of this interrogation, this dialectical relationship. And so, when people needed space to be able to perform, the clergy went out and sought the people who could have used the space. It was a community outreach. The demographic of the village had changed from Italian immigrants, which is one of the reasons why Judson was created and still has a neo-Gothic kind of look. It was a church designed to help the immigrants south of the park, and not to turn them off by having a very Protestant-looking building. So it's more of a European-looking building in a way. And Judson Church provided services of fresh water and cleaning. I'm sorry, not cleaning. Cooking classes, American cooking classes, and all these things to be of a institution of the community. But then as the 50s comes along, the demographics changes, and so you have a lot of artists. And when the clergy went out and started asking the artists, their community, what is it they needed, they just needed a place to show work. Not so much maybe even make work, because there was so many lofts that were available. And so the big abstract expressions paintings that we know, 9 foot tall, a lot of that was able to happen because all of the lofts in Soho and the space. So people had places to be able to work. But as far as presentation and showing things, the Judson Gallery was opened up to be able to show work, and the sanctuary was opened up for dance, where the Judson Dance Theater comes in. So this relationship of people who are hurt by religion, or running from religion, or critiquing religion, or don't want to have anything to do with religion, or completely atheist, like all of those folks were allowed to have their autonomous critiques and be able to come in. And the church saw that as a way of actually strengthening the actual work of what the church was supposed to mean for people in the first place. And so that's where this concept of the spiritual community comes in, where clergy and artists are working side by side to be able to make available community, make available space, make available non-censorship. There's no censorship at Judson for any work that comes through. So that's, at the end of the day, that's Paul Tillich's, that was part of Paul Tillich's vision of this Latent Church, this spiritual community of the church representing heterodox, which means something, a force coming from outside oneself. So the church representing this force, and then the artists are representing the autonomous force, and then those two things coming together and saying, okay, we can have this dialectic and create a vacant space amongst each other. So that's a big contribution that Paul Tillich, that my paper puts forward as having a direct influence on a bit availability to exist.
Yeah, and we'll, if it's okay, we'll link to your website, which has links to the paper, that we're mentioning, and then also the other projects that we were going to talk about: the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, new sanctuary, and visions. If that's okay, we'll link that to our website when we post the video. In our earlier conversation, and earlier in this conversation, you mentioned paradigm shifts, and when speaking about spiritual and artistic processes in contemporary art. Can you talk about your approach to that idea? How does that concept appear in your work?
Yeah, I guess we have to kind of mention, a little bit earlier moments. There was a show 2 years ago, it was at the Guggenheim, Hilma Afklint. The big thing about that show, along with the beautiful work that it is, was that Hilma Afklint was a was an abstractionist before the famous abstractionists that we know of, Piet Mondrian and Wassila Kandinsky. So Wassila Kandinsky and Piet Mondrian and Helmut Klimt, they were theosophists. If anybody is into biodynamic wine, which I'm crazy about now because it's got very low sulfites, real certified biodynamic wine comes out of Rudolf Steiner, who was an anthroposoph. There's a theosophy and anthroposophy. And so that comes out of that tradition, dealing with astrology and the lunar rotations and creating wines and all of that. So it was those spiritualist movements of the end of the 1800s was a big influence on abstraction. So thinking about visualizing the spiritual, their methods were, which I disagree with, even though I find the work to be compelling and beautiful, but their relationship to spiritual is that abstraction is the analog, the visual analog to spirituality. So in coming to my work, I look at more as bodies and processes of work as ways of actually how one actually witnesses the spiritual. And speaking specifically of like the Poor People's Campaign triptych that I created, and we'll probably talk more about that, but just the frame that I use for the triptych as opposed to 15th, 16th century or Middle Ages way of like the dark wooden frame for the triptych, I decided to be inspired by the Shakers, because the Shakers were proto-minimalists. And their minimalism was having direct lines to their theological beliefs, to the divine, who in their understanding was male and female, and so that helped with a lot of the understandings, the progressive understandings of women being on an equal footing as far as the leadership in the Shaker communities. But just back to the style and design itself, you already have a spiritual impulse into what would become a minimalism by having these direct, clean lines and 90-degree angles and all those kinds of things. So there is always a conversation. I mean, when we're going back into the Counter-Reformation, and we have the very dramatic lighting of Caravaggio. You know, that was an anti-Protestant movement. You know, so it's like we gotta make these Bible books come alive, and so we have to have this dramatic lighting in this chiaroscuro. So the relationship between the spiritual and the visuals is as old as culture goes. My particular instance, I fall into this post-abstraction, and it's part of the reason why I really do love photography. And it's because I actually don't believe in the analog of abstraction as the way for us to actually access a spiritual realm. And so activism of the Poor People's Campaign, that to me is how we visualize a spiritual realm. You know, or people actually manifesting and standing up to consider the least of these, and having a photojournalistic take on that is a manifestation of like what is ethics, morals, and spirituality in action, as opposed to a more abstract relationship to it. So that's where I see myself in that relationship. So the coming together of me adopting these critical realists, in photography we call that critical realism, or it can be called that, and who I went to study with at Cal Arts, Alan Sekula. That type of Southern Californian documentary, contemporary art photography is what was a very compelling way for me to go another level or another direction with my speculative realism, which is actually using realism or the so-called objectivity of the lens to get into actually seeing some metaphysical questions being laid out in front of us, where my mentor before, Alan Sekula, was shooting labor. He's shooting people working. to be able to critique late stage capitalism. I'm shooting spiritual movements to be able to critique those those similar elements and some other elements of my own that I have questions of as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you've just mentioned 16 things that I want to know more about, and I think everyone probably would like to know more about. Can we go back to the Poor People's Campaign and talk about connecting with this kind of tradition of the Shaker tradition? How did you find your way to that? And you know, I mean, what was that research process like? Did you already know about this, or was that part of making that work and finding something that maybe would fit in?
Yeah, well, you know, the one good thing, even though, you know, being an artist obviously is a tough choice, tough life, you know, as far as finances and stuff are concerned. But having the freedom to have free time to explore whatever is on your mind. The Shaker connection came from my girlfriend and I. We were up at a dance festival called Jacob's Pillow in the Berkshires, and so there's the Hancock Shaker Village, which is driving distance from there. And of course, I want to go see a Shaker Village because I've been familiar with the furniture for such a long time. You know, there's a couple of rooms at the Met. So it's just a no-brainer to go and see design because I'm interested in aesthetics. And then to go on to learn more about the community, how the design is connected to a form of theology, well, then it just makes a connection to me right there. So it's not so much of a research of coming up with a conceptual goal and then now I have to like buttress it with research. It's, well, what's my goal in life? And if there's a village that people made stuff from their theology that became turned into forms that we can have a relationship to it, then I got to go see it. And then hopefully that relationship brings like some kind of a seed when I need to use it at some other time. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that, again, so when I was looking at it and reading about the work, I had to do some more digging, and then I'm searching my kind of memory of being in some of those places, you know, or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts as a child, and just being amazed that, you know, this is something that I forgot about almost, you know, and it's interesting. And also, you also started to mention, and I think this kind of runs across a lot of the work that I've seen of yours, is the idea of a series of formats, which I think is also, and the way that that juxtaposition. I noticed a lot actually with sound and some of the pieces that piece that we didn't mention, Wages, your piece Wages, and how different styles and different formats are kind of working together, I suppose, next to each other and unexpected. And I love that so much about like found sound, studio sound, the cameraman being in the shot, you know, surveillance shots. It's a real mix of techniques and mechanics. And yeah, I think that, I guess the question would be, and this could even be a question for, say, Visions. You know, that surveillance setup shot is just amazing, and how the camera stationary, and so much is choreographed for the stationary camera. Of course, that was a conscious decision, and there's a long history of stationary cameras in film, and you know, but also I don't know if that piece could, and also in a lot of your pieces, could take place anywhere else. Like I imagine that piece in Asheville, like everyone would stop, and like in New York City, you know, you have someone doing yoga or whatever behind, and you know, all of the different things, and you're still able to occupy the space, and the piece, and everyone kind of moves along and doesn't think much of it, which is incredible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, New York is, you know, there's a difference between shooting, obviously, by changing locations. I did a lot of projects. My first film projects were in Los Angeles, and the logistics are different in Los Angeles. You know, how how people are moving about, getting permits for spaces, stuff that I've shot in New York. I haven't gotten permits, you just get out and shoot, and there's a certain respect of, well, there's something creative going on, so we either stand and watch it or we move on and allow them to do their thing. So that kind of like pluralism that takes place in the New York's form of cosmopolitanism is it's a healthy thing. It allows me to work without and allow things to actually unfold and take place, as opposed to having to do a lot of directing of things that I don't want to take place. If people walk by and they look or they sit, well, then that's a part of the presentation as well. That's a part of what's being exposed. And if I did it somewhere else, then there's other things that would come up about it. I do have to say, though, I'm not a person that is of the myth of being an artist in New York is the most paramount place that one needs to be to make work. I just want to say that.
Okay.
We're
it's not easy to live in New York, right?
No, it's not easy to live in New York, but then also the paradigms exist here, and there's probably some differences obviously in other places that there's different shifts, and I'm always interested in discovering those as well. That's why I like to travel as much as I do, to just see how one can be differently in other places. But to New York's credit, yeah, if you're trying to be a realist, without having to have too deep of a conversation about that, but allowing life to unfold in front of the camera. Yeah, you can pull out a camera in New York and let life unfold, and that be a part of what it is that you're trying to capture and represent.
Something that I wanted to go back to, something that you brought up earlier in New Sanctuary, and you call it a speculative documentary, which I love as well. And you mentioned it just a second ago, but could you talk a little bit more about settling on that approach for that particular work?
Yeah, Pierre Bourdieu says it a bit cynically, he's talking about, making art and like innovation, and you build on something that came before, and then you have your little twist to it, and then that's your name or your movement. And he says it cynically, but there's a lot of truth to it. But I think that it's important to have previous foundations that one has to build from. And I say that in a very honest way of, if we think about the philosophical hermeneutics of Gadamer and his talk of like tradition, I found, not to be too philosophical, but I like it when somebody has like a plan and they put it in front of you, and this is like how you can access this thing. And when I came into Alan Sekula's work, he's the first person that I saw that had text along with the images, and like they are inseparable from each other. They reinforce each other. So that's already like an interdisciplinary thing that I was actually looking for, because I like to write as well. So coming up with thinking about my work as speculative realism as opposed to critical realism is, I think that the one thing that I saw in critical realism that was not speaking to me was maybe a lack of magic at the end of the day. The critical realism definitely brings in the power of metaphor and all of the other things that comes along with art being a form of like a seer, looking out. But speculative realism, when you look at speculare, the actual Latin word, that means really to like look out. So calling myself a speculative artist as opposed to a conceptual artist, at the end of the day, I'm not really trying to make work that is a form of an algorithm, an artistic algorithm that dematerializes the object for the actual revealing of the process. I mean, there's definitely a process with what it is that I'm doing, but my process is actually trying to look out for the things that we have undiscovered. So when I look back, with all due respect to that critical realist relationship, there's a lot of like dealing with Marxism and talking about capitalism. But as I said, what's a shaman response, a shamanistic response to capitalism and greed? And so then be able to speak a language of a shaman where there's a little bit of a spirit walk that has to take place. There's guidance that is taking place that is not necessarily academic to be able to come with certain truths and realizations in the world. So coming to speculative realism is that, trying to make work that is a form of a window into some undiscovered countries that go back to how we actually relate to the so-called discovered lands that we are occupying at this time. That's my best way of saying it.
Yeah. I love it. And I do think that I would love if you have more to say about New Sanctuary, because it is such a powerful piece and powerful statement. And it works on so many levels, because you don't know, the credits are at the end. And so if you don't, so the way I watched it, I didn't read about it. I watched the film. And then I was able to find out more information at the end about the story. But the magical world that you create, and it really is bridging kind of these, this kind of reality and this other magical kind of speculative documentary, which I think is a really amazing kind of combining of I don't know if others use speculative documentary as a way of defining the work, but I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, well, there's a great there's a book called what is it, Critical Theory of Cinema. But anyway, it's a cognitive critical looking at cinema, and one of the writers is at a university in Leipzig in the film department. I can't remember her name right now, but it's either Leipzig which is Germany, or it's in the Netherlands. And I'm really now not doing justice. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
But they're like a group of theorists who are looking at this cognitive relationship to film, and one of the concepts is first-person documentary, right? So first-person documentary allows the subjectivities, subjectiveness of either director or the protagonist. In the case of New Sanctuary, it's very much a joint collaboration between me and Ramesh, who was fighting his deportation at the time, who was the protagonist of New Sanctuary. But that collaboration allows for our subjectivities of a faith walk, his faith walk of leaving work and going to the New Sanctuary clinic, where he's receiving support from lawyers and the spiritual community of multi-faith individuals who are there willing to fight on his behalf for him not to be deported. And I connected that with my story of walking in faith through the life of being an artist, and wanting to incorporate the things of my deep personhood along with trying to make it as an artist in this world, and changing the paradigms again of what I've already mentioned about the types of things that can be talked about in art, and what can be seen as what's important. So yeah, that I really did like what I read about thinking about the first person cinema, and so my term of speculative is because I'm just tying it directly into a photographic movement at the end of the day, which can turn into documentary and all the different modalities that I work in, and many other artists work in as well. I mean, dance is a form of script, and telling of stories and sharing of experience. So it's not just photo based, but I'm still a photographer at the end of the day, even when I make films. My eye for composition and movement and everything is still coming out of the still camera operator for such a long time. So yeah, the New Sanctuary is a project that brings in the speculative document, which is the film, But then also the empirical documents, which is the photography and the writing that goes along with it, which is my documentation of some of the day-to-day things of what it means to be someone who is fighting their deportation or dealing with ICE on a regular basis. So yeah, that bringing in of these empirical objective facts along with trying to bring a subjective relationship. Those are the ingredients that are always in play, even in the Poor People's Campaign. Just like what's one's feeling to the situation, what's one's feeling to the aesthetics, and then what is the movement that the aesthetics are representing or representing to people who are coming in contact with the movement. You know, we remember movements by aesthetic things. You know, the Nazis with the Sea Kyle, or the Black Panther movement, especially the gentleman at the Olympics who got their awards taken away from them because of having the Black Power fist up. So you know, we remember these instances in our history by the visuals that they leave us. And so obviously as a visual artist, having those conversations are there. But then what about the things that we actually can't see? And then the job of making aesthetic movements and motivations that are not seeable as well. And so that's very much where the speculative aspect comes in, because you know, you have to have instruments, right? We have science that creates instruments for us to measure things that we're having a sense that we're feeling, but are not necessarily knowing that are actually there. And art and science work in very similar ways, where as an artist, I'm trying to develop strategies and instruments to be able to try to flesh out and eke out, even if it's just for a flash of lightning, and moments or entities or elements that are always with us, but are and motivating us and motivating society, but aren't necessarily able to be captured by the so-called objective lens of the camera. But then the last thing I'll say on that is, you know, why I love being a lens-based artist, and what I really enjoy about it is that because of this human invention, you know, that starts with glass and these complicated mathematics, you know, it's like we get a telescope, and the telescope lets us know that no, it's not the sun going around us, but the other way around. We also use that same lens for microscopes, you know, to let us know about things that we could never perceive, but yet are there. And so the microscope brings that to us. But then, you know, the lens brings us these intangible aspects of life that motivate us as well. That's why we go to the movies, right? We go to the movies to see love, to see hope, you know, care, despair, tragedy. These things are brought to us through the lens. And they're not provable tangibles, but yet they're still very much a part of what motivates us to be who we are, as individuals in community with each other. And so the lens brings us that as well. You know, that's why these superhero, we can go on forever about that, but that's why these superhero movies are so all over the place now. You know, it's the way of coping with people's anxieties of the terror that's always around us, as far as domestic terrorism, foreign terrorism. So you can't. It's not like the '80s where you could like name it's Russia, so then you come out with Rambo, and you know, the anti-communist, you know, slew of the strong man type movies. You know, the evil is more insidious, and so the characters of a Marvel seem to be the better prepared for people's psyche to deal with the unknown things that they're doing. And that's not me coming up with that. I believe that's Althusser that said, pay attention to people's entertainment so you can know what they're actually really anxious about, like what's the moment that they're really anxious about. And so it's no just coincidence that there's so much of running to the cinema, which is lens based, for people to have a reality being materialized for them, the fight between good and evil. So that's why I love about the lens, because everybody comes to it as it's supposed to be this truth and this fact, And yet there's so much more nuance and use that one can get out of the lens at the end of the day. So I enjoy very much that I didn't paint the image. I allowed the image to like be in front of the camera, and so that there's a certain tension between veracity and then something that is not seen, something that is not necessarily thought as being objectively recorded, but then yet at the same time you witness, speaking of New Sanctuary, Ramesh's actual plight through faith and work
Mhm.
and fear and anxiety. And we all got to experience that, hopefully, through this mechanism that is supposedly supposed to be bringing truth and, I guess, objectivity to the person who is witnessing that moment. So those tensions are what I love, and then I increase those tensions by mixing them with movement, with dance, with as opposed to just regular pedestrian movements. There's all more stylized dance movements, and then obviously with still photography, which is another form of meditation, as opposed to a moving image, which is a different form of meditation and sharing experience. So I think it's in the frequency of these things being next to each other, where for me the actual work is actually taking place.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have one last question for you, because I'm looking at the clock, and we've all been experiencing, and you touched on this just a little bit, really difficult days lately. This past year has been very heavy in so many ways for so many reasons. And as a closing question, I wanted to ask, where do you find hope these days?
Well, my relationship with hope, and this would be the last theorist that I name, but you can
Okay.
tell that I'm in conversation with these folks. But I pay attention to Ernst Bloch, who was part of the Frankfurt School, and his writing was about hope, and what does hope look like in society? One of the big fancy terms that he used was anticipatory illumination, and
Hmm.
which is just a big term for uh, uh, how does one actually see the thing, or how is the thing that we are hoping for get illuminated? So I look at art as that way. That's why I like dance so much, because you're actually able to see alternative ways of actually moving and dealing with space. So you know the the notion of trying to Block gets into like the difference of like wishing and hoping, and like wish doesn't have so much of an active thing, like, oh, I wish it was sunny today. And you can't really do much with that, right? It is what it is. So you can wish it, but that's kind of a beginning and an end process there. But hope is trying to visualize something and then trying to actually realize the vision as a form of it being a beacon or a light, an illumination to people who are looking to go into that direction, if it could be of help to them. So for me, hope is the actual act of trying to create the vision, trying to actually make visible the vision. And so that's why you do a project and then you don't stop at that. You go to the next one, because
Mhm.
there's a continual desire and need, and hope is based in desire and need for the better, for the just, for the right, for the feeling good. All of these things that make up the human experience, and what makes a worthy human experience, not just simply existing in a flat way. So I wouldn't be able to say that, oh, I hope that, from the election, I hope that Biden wins, and so that Biden Harris ticket, that's my vision of like hope, and then they're going to get to work. That's not it for me, because I believe that it's really up to us to try to manifest those visions in our daily lives. And I'm not just
Mhm.
speaking about artists, and I'm speaking about everybody. how do you show examples of kindness and good parenting, or spending time to teach young people something. So what does that look like? Oh, well, I could take a picture of that, and that could be the picture of hope that is an example for other people to see someone spending time, an older person spending time with a younger person. I just set that as an example, but it's like it can be visualized, and I believe that the artist's job is to like be an incubator of visions in a form of research and development, so that it can then be material that it can be picked up by politicians, by teachers, better pedagogy, by any system that creates culture that is part of society. The artist has the ability to create hope by making those visions in the first place. So that would be my definition of like how I get by, is by actually looking for the ability to be able to make real and sensible to people a vision that I have in me, or a vision that I'm trying to translate from a community who are actively working on that vision. Because at the end of the day, New Sanctuary is just a translation of the work that takes place at Judson. Going back to this concept of the latent church or the spiritual community. It's a spiritual community who worked with Ramesh for him to no longer have to show up to ICE. And my job as a documentary artist, is a speculative artist, is to come in and how do we actually expand the audience of that vision of hope, because all those folks are creating hope visions of it. How do I actually expand that into a larger and maybe longer lasting visual representation at the end of the day? So that's my actual relationship to hope, is actually through the making or translation into real sensible forms of acts of hope that are being realized every day.
André, thank you so much for taking the time today, and thank you so much for your work, your art, and your work with Judson and New Sanctuary, and for all that you do.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.